So, invaders, bloodshed, famine, ultimately leading up to the Pale Rider. The Pale Horse, sometimes referred to as the Ashen Horse. Some translations will have Pale Green Horse. The reason we have so many different colors is that none of them truly express what is being expressed here. The idea of the color here is the color of decaying flesh. You think of somebody die, a dead body, and their flesh is decaying, that's the color of this horse. All right. What do you call that color? Well, that's why you get pale, you get ashen, you get pale green. Furthermore, we're told more about all this because the rider's name is Death. Right? War, bloodshed, famine, violence, all connected with death. And following with death is Hades. So what we have here, of course, is the personification of two forces. This is not teaching that there's a Grim Reaper out there who comes for us. Right? It's a personification of the force of death. Hades, of course, is the realm of the dead. And so death, the realm of the dead, are coming to scoop up those that have been subject to invasion, bloodshed, and famine. But in being given their authority, there's that passive again, their authority extends over what? Verse 8. Their authority extends over 1/4 of the earth. So, is this a promise or a prophecy that 25% of people, the Roman Empire, for example, are going to die? No. Again, should always take the numbers of Revelation very figuratively, symbolically first. So what is being communicated by saying they're given authority over 1/4 of the earth? Yeah, I mean, 1/4, depending on the size, 1/4 is sizable, right? I mean, if you thought of 1/4 of the people of Earth today died, that'd be like almost 2 billion people, right? So it can be sizable, but it's not complete. And so, it's sizable but not complete. And the authority that they're given over 1/4 of the earth is to kill with the sword, with famine, with pestilence, and with wild animals. And we talked about Ezekiel 14 and how that fits into this description. So the first 4 seals coming in very rapid-fire, quick succession. Right? The rider, what's given to the rider, next rider, what's given, and so it's very, very rapid. But let's pause a second before we move on into the 5th seal to think about some questions. Because as we're thinking about it, these horses and riders are being active at God's command. But what do they represent? Well, they represent things like death and violence and bloodshed and scarcity and military might. So how do we make sense of a just but merciful God using these forces against human beings? Especially when we think of, famine, bloodshed. Is God using evil as a means of judgment? Does God do that kind of thing? Let's turn to the passage that I think might help here, 1 Kings chapter 22. The context of 1 Kings chapter 22 is Ahab, King Ahab of Israel, is preparing to go off to battle. And he has enlisted the help of King Jehoshaphat of Judah. And so Jehoshaphat comes to Israel, to Ahab, to help him in this battle. But before they go off, Jehoshaphat wants to hear from the Lord, wants to hear from Yahweh about whether they'll be successful or not. And so Ahab brings in all of these prophets. And they're all saying, go up, you're going to be granted success. Go up, you're going to be granted success. And Jehoshaphat says, no, I want a prophet of Yahweh. I want a prophet of the Jewish God, the Israelite God. Not all your fake prophets. And Ahab says, well, there's this one guy. And this guy has nothing good to say to me. He never has anything positive. But let's pray. And so Micaiah, the prophet of God, the prophet of Yahweh, is brought to come before and prophesy. And so he's kind of warned them away. Here's what all the prophets are saying, and say something positive. He comes in. And Ahab says to him, here's what we want to do. Should we go up? Will we be successful? And Micaiah says, go up. You'll be successful. And Ahab says, how many times have I told you to tell me the truth? Now, the odd thing here is all his prophets have been saying that. And so Micaiah comes in, and he knows the prophets have been lying, because Micaiah says that, and he says, go up. The thing that Ahab's been wanting to say, wanting to hear. And so Ahab says, how often have I told you to tell me the truth? And so Micaiah then says, all right, the truth is, I saw all of Israel scattered in the mountains as sheep without a shepherd. And Ahab turns to Jehoshaphat and says, see, didn't I tell you, he never says anything good about me. Then Micaiah says this, 1 Kings chapter 22, beginning verse 19. Then Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, with all the host of heaven standing beside him to the right and to the left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, so that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? Then one said one thing, and another said another, until a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. How? The Lord asked him. He replied, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then the Lord said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do it. So you see, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has decreed disaster for you. And so Micaiah says, God has used a lying spirit in your prophets for you to go into battle and fall, so that you would go and die, which eventually is what Ahab does. So how do we understand this in the book of Revelation? Because we want to try and make sure to protect God, as if our own actions could protect God, from charging him with evil. So how do we go about that? Well, one way would be to say, well, these people are simply reaping the consequences of their lifestyle, especially as it pertains to Christians, right? They're persecuting Christians, and so now they're reaping the consequences of that. Others would say, well, God is simply allowing it to happen. And God allows evil to happen. Well, we don't want to forget God's in control of all this. And in each of these cases, something was given to these rioters. Right? So God's in authority. God is giving authority to these people. It's not just kind of God stepping back and saying whatever happens, happens. God is actively involved here. We can also ask in light of this of, are our views of God perhaps too simplistic in thinking about what God does and how God works? There are a couple of passages in the Old Testament, I think, that are very instructive related to this. The first one what I look at is Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 39. Speaking through Moses, God says, "See now that I, even I, am He. There is no God besides me. I kill, and I make alive. I wound, and I heal, and no one can deliver from my hand." And then also Exodus chapter 4, being another passage that would fit in here with this discussion as well. In the context of Exodus 4, of course, Moses is offering all his excuses about why he can't go to Pharaoh. And so he says, verse 10, "But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" And so we kind of, I think, sometimes have this rather simplistic view of God in saying God's just, God's merciful, all of which are true. But we want that to be a very simplistic, meaning that God doesn't sometimes do some very terrible, violent things. Always working within His justice, always doing the right things, but He doesn't always work the way we think He should work. Ultimately, though, even though this is a warning about what's going to happen to the people, the pagans, the Romans that are persecuting Christians, it is a wake-up call to the churches. They've become too complacent in their relationship toward the pagan world. And so see, this is what's coming for them. Are you going to side with them, or are you going to side with God? Questions, comments? All right, so we turn now to the fifth seal. Now, one of the things we might ask is the opening of this seal showing us the reason for the previous four? And that the four riders come forth because of what we see, what we encounter in this fifth seal. And when the fifth seal is open, John sees an altar. And specifically sees under the altar. Now, what would be the purpose of looking and seeing an altar? What would the idea of an altar convey? All right, sacrifice. So, in the context of Jewish mindset, biblical mindset, what altar might this be? Or at least be connected to? All right, the altar in the temple, but which one? Because there were actually two in the temple, in the entire precincts of the temple. And there was the temple of burnt offering, but then there was also, the altar of burnt offering, but also the altar of incense, which we talked about last Thursday. So which altar is it? Well, on one sense, we have the idea of sacrifice, and we'll see these people as being sacrificed. So we might say the altar of burnt offering, but then we also could think about the idea of the prayers of the saints being offered as incense. So, okay, maybe it's the altar of incense, which appears more frequently in Revelation. So, altar of incense might seem make more sense in a Christian mindset, because with the altar of burnt offering, what was the purpose of the altar of burnt offering? Right, to atone for sin. But now for Christians, is there necessity for that altar? No, right? Jesus' sacrifice is taking care of that. So that kind of suggests, well, probably not the altar of burnt offering. It could possibly be an amalgamation of both. And so ideas of both are kind of presented here. But what we see there through John's eyes and writing are souls. Interesting that he says souls and not bodies or people. But they are under the altar. Now, how does that work? If you're offering a sacrifice, you usually sacrifice something on the altar. So how is it that they're under the altar? Well, some people have suggested, the altar in the temple was often seen or connected to the throne of God. And so, if you are coming to God, if you're coming to a throne, you're below it, under it. And so maybe that's why they're under the altar. But it could also be to suggest that they are under God's protection. And so, the altar being under God's protection. Or it could also be a reference to how the blood poured on an altar, as was frequently part of the Jewish sacrifices, would then pool at the bottom. And so maybe those kind of things suggest why they're under the altar as opposed to on it. But they are souls. The souls of who? Who are these people? Okay. How do we know that?
People who have been sacrificed because of their belief.
All right, so first they're described as those that have been slaughtered or slain, right, suggesting that they have died, right, which of course fits in with the idea of the sacrifice. Now, of course, we could ask, is this a literal death, or a literal slaughter, a literal being slain, or is it metaphorical? Right? So is it only applying to those that have been killed, or to all those who had suffered persecution? Well, probably the emphasis is on those that have died for their faith. But certainly we can make an application to all of those that had suffered persecution. But notice that they were slaughtered just like the lamb had been slaughtered, right? So when John turns to see the lamb in chapter 5, he sees the lamb standing as if it had been slain or slaughtered. And so here are these people who have been slaughtered or slain. They have been slain for the word of God. But not only that, for the testimony they had given. So there's kind of two things in here that are in view. So they are slain for the word of God, dealing with the message itself. It's because of the message that they have. Right? The message about Christ, we can think about the living out of that message, the very challenging nature of that message, that there's another king, there's another Lord other than Caesar. That's led to their death. But it's also been their personal commitment to that message in their lives. Right? So not just the message itself, but their personal commitment. These are the examples of those from chapter 2 and chapter 3 that have conquered. Right? And probably not exactly, specifically those people, because there's only one person named as being killed, Antipas. But it serves as a reminder of conquering. What are the souls under the altar doing when the fifth seal is open? They're crying out with a loud voice. Right? They are making an appeal. We can almost say they're praying, in a sense, a prayer of calling for God to act.